Like most Americans, when I think of the Vietnam War, I think of a bunch of hippies protesting and some dudes getting attacked by helicopters in the jungle. But despite what Hollywood would have you believe, the Vietnam War was much more complex than napalm and the occasional Viet Cong attack. In fact, there is so much to talk about that I am going to give you the entire history of the Vietnam War in just under 7 minutes. Let's do this. The Vietnam War was the second longest war that the United States ever fought, the longest being World War II. So it was not out of the question for the U.S. government to get involved in the affairs of a small Southeast Asian nation. Well, maybe it is out of the question, but this is America we're talking about. In order to understand the war, we first need to understand French Indochina. You see, in the 1800s, the French colonized the region, splitting it into three: French Indochina, which we today call Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French ruled over their colony with an iron fist, which made the local population really not like the French very much. One group of people who did and liked the French rule were called the Viet Minh, or the Vietnamese Independence League. They tried multiple times to break away from the Dutch East India Company, failing until finally in 1945 when they took control of northern Vietnam. This new country was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or THEDRAV, while the French still controlled southern Vietnam. In 1946, the French returned to Vietnam and immediately went to war with the Viet Minh. The First Indochina War lasted 8 years and resulted in the Geneva Accords in 1954, splitting Vietnam along the 17th parallel with the DRV in the north and the state of Vietnam in the south. And everybody said, "Sweet, let's all be friends now." Okay, not exactly. See, while the fighting had stopped, both sides wanted all of Vietnam and refused to accept the other's rule over the whole country. Now the U.S. enters the picture. Since the end of World War II, the U.S. had been trying to stop the spread of communism. And even though both sides in Vietnam were communists, the U.S. decided to back the less communist of the two evils, the state of Vietnam. The U.S. saw the region as critical in stopping the spread of communism in Asia, right next to the heavily communist China and Russia. If Vietnam fell to communism, then the dominoes would fall and all of Southeast Asia would turn red. Like Domino's Pizza, except instead of pizza, it's communism, and instead of delivery, it's the Red Army. In order to keep South Vietnam from falling to the communists, the U.S. sent military advisors and supplied the South Vietnamese army with weapons. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was getting aid from their buddies, the North Koreans, who hadn't started World War III yet, and the Chinese. In 1960, things got violent when a bunch of Buddhist monks in South Vietnam set themselves on fire in protest of the government. Things escalated quickly, and soon the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, was formed to fight against the South Vietnamese government. The Gulf of Tonkin incident happened in 1964. This was when the U.S. destroyer the Maddox was patrolling near the coast of North Vietnam when suddenly a bunch of North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked them. A few days later, another attack happened, and the U.S. responded by bombing the living crap out of North Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the president to take any measures necessary to defend U.S. ships and basically gave President Johnson permission to start a war. And so he did. The war escalated quickly. By 1965, 200,000 U.S. troops were fighting in Vietnam. To fight in the jungle, the U.S. used something called search and destroy. American troops would go into a village, kill everyone, and burn their homes. Then they de-leave and hope that whoever survived would leave the Communist Party and maybe pick up a guitar and become a folk singer. That's what the U.S. hoped anyway. The problem was that the Viet Cong knew the jungle like the back of their hand. They'd hide in tunnels and ambushed unsuspecting American platoons. These constant losses caused massive casualties and a lot of bad feelings towards the war in America. Protests broke out on college campuses, and soon people were saying things like, "Hey, let's not kill each other." Johnson won the election, but he decided not to run for re-election in 1968. Instead, his vice president, Richard Nixon, ran on a platform of peace. Nixon was elected, and peace seemed to be at hand. The U.S. and North Vietnam met at the Paris peace talks and signed the agreement in 1973. The U.S. withdrew its troops and everything was good. Right? No, it wasn't. You see, while the peace talks were happening, the North Vietnamese army was marching south and taking over cities. By 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, was under siege. On April of that year, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon and the war was over. The last U.S. troops left on helicopters, abandoning the South Vietnamese government and people. Vietnam was now under the control of the Communists and had become the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built in Washington, D.C., honoring the 58,000 Americans who died in the conflict. Some people say that the reason the U.S. lost the war was because the Vietnamese people didn't like them. But if that's true, why don't they like us? You know, our flag is kind of cool. We have stars and stripes and a bald eagle holding an olive branch. I mean, how could anyone not love that? Well, it turns out that the Vietnamese people had a big problem with this. During the war, the U.S. military developed something called the Phoenix Program. It was a secret project designed to identify and assassinate members of the Viet Cong and suspected spies. Now, the problem with this program was that it wasn't very precise. Innocent people were killed and entire villages were burned to the ground. Even after the war ended, the Phoenix Program continued to operate, killing suspected communists in other countries. The other reason the U.S. lost the war is because they couldn't win hearts and minds. Seriously, how hard is it to get people to like you? We make videos about ancient history and people seem to enjoy them. Sure, we get a few comments telling us how terrible we are at making videos and how we should kill ourselves, but most people seem to like us. The U.S. tried winning people over by building schools, roads, and medical clinics. But these projects often didn't help the people they were meant to help. For example, many Vietnamese farmers did not know how to use pesticides and the crops they grew on their new farms would die. Also, many of the roads and buildings the U.S. built were destroyed during the war. Yet despite all the suffering, Vietnam has come a long way since the war. The country is now one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In 2006, Vietnam and the U.S. normalized diplomatic relations, and today, Vietnam is a popular destination for tourists. I visited Vietnam in 2015 and it's an amazing place. The people are friendly, the food is delicious, and the beer is cheap. I know that this video was very fast-paced and we barely scratched the surface of this horrific war. But if you want to learn more about the Vietnam War, I recommend watching Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's documentary, The Vietnam War. It's 18 hours long, but it's so worth it. If you want to learn more about cool events from history, stay tuned.